XRP is sitting at a level that has frustrated investors for months, and the biggest question now isn't whether the XRP story sounds exciting, it's why the price still hasn't responded the way so many holders expected. With XRP hovering around the $1 area, investors are watching every move and asking the same thing. Is this simply another period of weakness, or is the market quietly preparing for a much bigger move? The interesting part is that the conversation around XRP hasn't disappeared. In fact, there are still major developments happening around regulation, institutional adoption, the XRP Ledger, and Ripple's role in the broader financial system, yet the price action remains stubborn. That disconnect is exactly what makes this moment so important. The transcript points to XRP approaching a decision point, with the market potentially preparing to choose between another move higher or another leg lower. And that creates the central question for today. What happens next if XRP remains stuck around this level? One side of the market believes this is accumulation. The idea is that institutions and larger players could be positioning themselves while retail investors become increasingly impatient. The other side sees a completely different picture. They look at XRP's price and say, if all these developments are so important, why isn't the market already pricing them in? That frustration is showing up clearly among XRP holders. People have waded through regulatory uncertainty, delayed expectations, repeated predictions about major adoption, and now they're watching XRP struggle to break away from the same price zone. At some point, the question changes from when will XRP explode to what evidence would actually prove that the next move has started. And this is where we need to separate the XRP narrative from the XRP price. Ripple President Monica Long is talking about an Internet of Value, with Ripple positioning itself around institutions and enterprise adoption. She also highlighted Ripple's regulatory footprint and more than 75 licenses around the world. That sounds significant, but Ripple succeeding as a company does not automatically mean XRP must immediately rise in price. The same distinction matters with the Clarity Act. The transcript describes the legislation as being stuck in what one Bitwise executive called a kind of zombie state, with the possibility of further action later rather than an immediate resolution. So right now, XRP holders are caught between two realities. The infrastructure and institutional story continues developing, while the market price is refusing to cooperate. And that is exactly why the next move matters more than another prediction. If XRP breaks out of this decision zone, the market will have to reconsider the idea that nothing is happening. But if XRP loses this level and starts moving lower, investors will immediately ask whether all those bullish narratives were simply ahead of the actual demand. So before we talk about where XRP could go, we need to understand what is actually keeping the price stuck right now, and what would have to change for XRP to finally break out. But here's where the situation gets more interesting. If XRP is stuck around this level, the biggest mistake would be assuming that price alone tells us everything that is happening underneath the surface. Markets can remain quiet while positioning changes. And they can also remain quiet because buyers simply aren't strong enough yet. That distinction matters. The comments from XRP holders show both sides of the argument. Some investors believe XRP is being accumulated quietly and that the current price is an opportunity. Others are becoming increasingly frustrated because they have heard the same bullish arguments for years without seeing the price deliver the move they were expecting, and honestly, that frustration is understandable. Because if XRP really is entering a major adoption phase, investors want to know one simple thing. When does that adoption actually translate into demand for XRP? That is the question we need to focus on. Ripple can build partnerships. Institutions can explore blockchain infrastructure. The XRP Ledger can continue developing. Regulatory clarity can improve. But none of those things automatically creates a massive XRP price increase overnight. What matters is whether these developments eventually create sustained demand for the token itself. And that brings us back to the institutional story. The discussion around institutional custody has clearly created concern among some XRP holders. Several commenters are questioning whether moving assets away from self-custody is really necessary, while others believe institutions accumulating or holding digital assets could become an important part of the next phase of the market. But these are two separate questions. One question is where you choose to store your XRP. The much bigger question is whether institutional participation creates meaningful additional demand for XRP. Those two things should not be confused. And this is also why I don't think we should blindly celebrate every headline involving banks, institutions, or Ripple. The XRP community has heard plenty of exciting announcements before. What matters now is measurable progress. Are more institutions actually using the technology? Are transactions increasing? Is liquidity expanding? Is XRP being used for real-world settlement? And most importantly, Is there evidence that demand is beginning to outpace the available supply? Because that is the point where the conversation changes. Right now, XRP holders are waiting for confirmation. They don't simply want another prediction that XRP is about to explode. They want something they can actually see in the market. And that explains why the $1 area has become psychologically important. If XRP continues holding around this level while broader adoption develops, some investors will interpret that as quiet accumulation. But if the price continues failing to break higher, others will argue that the market simply isn't convinced yet. Neither side should be treated as automatically correct. The market eventually decides, and there is another major variable hanging over everything: regulation. The Clarity Act remains an important part of the broader crypto conversation, but the source material itself describes the legislation as delayed and uncertain, rather than something investors should treat as guaranteed. That means XRP holders shouldn't build their entire thesis around one political event. Instead, watch what happens when regulatory progress, institutional activity, and actual network demand begin moving in the same direction. That combination would be far more meaningful than another headline. So the real question isn't simply, when will XRP moon? The better question is, what evidence would prove that XRP has finally stopped being stuck? Now here's the part XRP holders really need to watch. If XRP is going to break out of this stuck phase, we need more than another bullish headline. We need confirmation. The first thing to watch is whether XRP can finally establish strength above the current range, instead of repeatedly getting rejected. A breakout that holds is very different from a quick spike that disappears a few hours later. The second signal is demand. If institutional participation continues increasing, the important question is whether that activity actually translates into greater demand for XRP itself. Ripple's broader institutional strategy and the development of the XRP Ledger are important pieces of the story. But the market still has to prove that those developments are creating sustained demand. And then there's regulation. The Clarity Act remains a major source of uncertainty, and the discussion around it shows just how much investors are waiting for clearer rules. But XRP doesn't have to wait for one single event to determine its future. That's the key point. If XRP continues holding while adoption, liquidity, and institutional interest gradually build, this period could eventually look very different in hindsight. But if the price keeps failing to respond, investors have every right to question the bullish thesis. So instead of chasing predictions, watch the evidence. Watch the price, watch liquidity, watch real usage, watch institutional activity, and most importantly, watch whether demand begins to overpower the supply available in the market. Because eventually XRP will have to make a decision. It can remain stuck, it can break lower, or it can finally break higher and force the market to rethink everything. Nobody knows exactly when that moment arrives, but one thing is certain: the next meaningful move will tell us far more than another bullish headline ever could. If you're holding XRP, stay focused on the evidence, not the hype. And if you want more XRP analysis without the hype, subscribe to OG John XRP Insights. This is where the real XRP story gets interesting.